Ingrid was hugging a tree. What did it feel like this morning?
It was a very nice way to start the day.
Good. It is. It's a wonderful way to start a day, is to go out and hug a tree. So if you haven't done it yet, well then when Marion takes you around the
Oh,
park,
I've got a lovely one for them.
find a tree and hug it.
And the tree whispered to me, kiss them, I will be your prince.
While your queen is off hugging the terracotta soldiers of 2,000 years ago, she's touched them. I saw the pictures of her this morning. She has touched the terracotta soldiers. I didn't see her hugging one.
Certainly not 8,000.
Not all 8,000 of them, but
It seems to be 8,000.
yes, there's 6,000. They estimate there are another 2,000 at least in that standing army. They stood for 2,000 years. Amazing. Something seems to stand. We could venture to think about that a bit, I suppose. Well, this morning we come to stanza 5. I hope you're not all thoroughly confused by this time. Adam straightens you out in the afternoon with what I confuse you with in the morning. We are leaping, literally leaping and galloping through the stanzas, but I hope you're finding this of some value and interest. We will know whether I'm ever invited back to you by the Holy Trinity that govern the school. Momentarily it has become a quaternity, and that means, I guess, manifestation has occurred somehow. Well, there's so much today that I'd like to touch upon that I probably will bewilder you even further. But before we proceed too far, because this, in one sense, this stanza describes the third stage in the cosmic process and deals with what is my favorite character in the whole Secret Doctrine. And I say that it's my favorite character because HPB calls this element one of the most, if not the most important character in esoteric cosmogony. Our good friend Fohat, who has a great number of other designations, including that of Eros in the Greek, the original Greek metaphysical system, and well, a number of other characteristics, a number of other names, and shows up in a number of different guises. So he's rather difficult to follow, and I suppose that's why he's one of my favorite characters. But before we proceed with the studies, with the stanza, which carries us forward in this whole process of the awakening, and I say the third stage, although the fifth stanza, and one about which HPB immediately informs us that it is probably the most difficult, she says, of all the stanzas to explain, which doesn't seem to have daunted numerous generations of Theosophists since their time. We all proceed then to attempt our own explanation. I think we're fortunate in many ways that the readers or students of her time were not able to grasp perhaps as as quickly now. That isn't to say that we can grasp it all, but let's remind ourselves then that the first stage is that given in stanza 3 of the process bursting forth into manifestation, described as darkness radiating light, a phrase that we've considered. First stage, therefore, which is marked in perhaps by a polarization, a separation, but a polarization of the unmanifest principles of being from their original state of fusion. So I'm using stanzas 1 and 2 as, of course, pre-manifestation. Now this is the third. That first stage of a polarization, a radial expansion of what we may call along the spirit-matter dimensions of the web. And as a result of that, there is the formation of levels or planes of consciousness, fields in which consciousness can become active. Although dimension cannot be assigned to it, we can say that the expansion is both vertical and horizontal. We have to depict this somehow, so we use these terms in terms of the expansion and contraction of consciousness or conscious experience throughout these fields. The second stage, which is discussed in stanza 4, the activation of the contents, and then therefore in terms of this principle of hierarchy. The concept of hierarchy becomes extremely important. It's being recognized very much in contemporary biology, in fact. It's therefore before the entirely unmanifest content of the, we can only call the ever darkness, or what HPB calls the ever darkness, can be brought into full objectivity of the material universe. It has to be brought into, shall we say, it has to be revealed in the imaginal content of the divine mind. Therefore we call that the archetypes, archetypal realm, the divine imaginals, if you wish. It's a nice word, imaginals. I've noticed Bianchi looks up with raised eyebrows, but, you know, I have to throw in some things now and then. So that we can see that just as the unmanifest content of the darkness can only be explicitly known when differentiated and spread out in space-time, so all cosmogonies have to treat of levels or fields as if they were spatially separate. As if, now that as if is what is most important. Whereas, because in fact they are simultaneously present. We are at this moment living in the totality of these fields, in the creative process. And therefore every level is in us and around us. This simultaneity is, now that's a good word, that's not my invention. This simultaneity in presence of the fields is validated by concepts which are being presented to us today by a number of thinkers. David Bohm, Fritjof Capra, Rupert Sheldrake, a very interesting person in the United States in the medical field, Larry Dossey, whose work, Space, Time, and Medicine, puts this into medical terms about healing. Larry Dossey is an internist of considerable reputation in Dallas, Texas. He has, again, he's one who has spoken at the Katona School, and is putting this into medical terms, which I think is extremely interesting.
There's a correspondence that a familiar example you could use in this, and that is where is the totality of our knowledge when we're not thinking about it?
Yes.
or of our
Yeah.
memory when
That's
we're
a
not
very good,
calling
yes,
it,
when we're not
because
calling on it.
time is collapsed,
Yes.
the material is collapsed,
Mhm.
we're unconscious of it, and yet
Yes.
it's all there to be brought forth when we want.
When we want it, yes. And it can be stimulated. The work of Penfield Wilder on the brain, for example, in connection with memory, and the electrical stimulation of certain parts of the cortex of the brain that awakens certain total memories with all their ramifications, that single electrical stimulus. And electricity, as we know, is one of the variations of Fohat. So in that sense, it is this same energy throughout in its various permutations. I think that's an excellent analogy, Jeffrey, because where is the totality of your knowledge? I mean, even if you say, I don't know very much, you know a great number of factual details. It's incredible, the number of factual details that we do have available. And where is it when you're not calling upon it? You see, it does not occupy some spatial area, and yet it is present and can be unfolded in a quite amazing way. So before proceeding further, I just wanted to look a little bit at some of the concepts that are being proposed in contemporary science. I'm sure you're all familiar with the work of Rupert Sheldrake, for example, who, of course, has spoken at your summer school, when was it, last year or the year before, whenever it was. And the work that Rupert has proposed in his book, of course, A New Science of Life. Rupert's at work on another book, he tells me, and I don't know when it's going to come out. And of course, this is still being tested, and there are still, of course, many who do not agree with him, naturally. And it's still being tested, and there are some points of it that one does somewhat, one takes him to task for from a theosophical point of view. Although he is himself a theosophist, I think he is not. That is, he's a member of the society, I should put it that way. I think he is not fully familiar with some aspects of the whole metaphysical system. But his premise of this hypothesis of formative causation still is an interesting one to explore. As we know, it centers around the concept that all systems are regulated not only by material factors or by energy, but by invisible organizing fields. And that in itself, I think, is an interesting postulate. Fields which he suggests do not have energy in a measurable sense, but that would not exclude their dynamism from the metaphysical sense. And that, I think, is something he has not yet taken into account, but are nonetheless causative because they serve as blueprints. There is an invisible matrix, in other words, which Sheldrake has termed a morphogenetic field. That is a field in which form originates, morphogenetic form, the origin of form. And the field itself provides the possibility of a resonance, and so he speaks of morphic resonance. It provides a resonance which establishes form and behavior. Now, I've discussed with him on occasions whether that resonance in itself, while perhaps not measurable by scientific instruments, may not be of the nature of energy or a dynamism. It certainly has a movement which moves to concretize form around a kind of, to compare it with crystals, an axial structure, which is in itself not seen, but which reveals itself as the form concretizes around it, as we have in crystals. Rupert said, well, yes, perhaps, but since it's not measurable, he cannot, of course, call it that. I think that nevertheless that this is in effect a field, a generalized field. Incidentally, some of our debates with Rupert have been over the fact that he suggests that there is a field for each part of an organism rather than an overriding field. Rene Weber, whose book has just recently been published of Conversations with Sages and Scientists, Dialogues with Sages and Scientists, has had long discussions with Rupert on the relation between these individual fields and an overriding field which might be called Akasha, which Rupert is not ready to venture into as yet, let me say. But this too could possibly be that the resonance is possible because of the nature of the field itself, the fundamental field. And Akasha, or Chidakasha more properly, as it moves into manifestation. Along with that, of course, and I have mentioned on several occasions the work of Dr. John Wheeler, who was, of course, an associate, younger associate of Einstein, who is now in Texas. Texas seems to draw a number of these people, in which he regards the universe as a self-excited circuit, and he uses that term, a self-excited circuit, that within it is its own dynamism, and this would certainly again be analogous to the proposals in the Secret Doctrine, and particularly here in Stanza 5. He suggests that no elementary phenomenon is a phenomenon until it is registered or observed. That is the central, from his point of view, the central revolutionary lesson of quantum theory. No less revolutionary for quantum theory being the solid guiding principle of all of modern physics. No less solid for our not having yet fathomed that theory's deep and secret underpinnings. So he continues, the universe does not exist out there, independent of us. We are inescapably involved in bringing about that which appears to be happening. We are not only observers, we are participators in some strange sense. This is a participatory universe. So from his point of view, the existence of the observer completes the circuit, but it is a self-excited circuit, as he calls it, self-excited, so that the dynamism is inherent in the system, as it were. The implication, of course, is quite amazing, I think, of all of this. And the theosophical perspective, it seems to me, adds that therefore consciousness is primary, and we are dealing with self-excitation of consciousness, or the awakening of the universal mind by means of its own inherent nature. There's a statement by Dr. Wheeler that I think is quite an incredible one. We will first understand how simple the universe is when we recognize how strange it is. Quite an amazing statement. Well, in terms of this, I think we have to recognize that we are indeed moving in much of modern thinking towards the recognition that the process is in some manner conscious through and through. I'd like to share with you a statement by one of the eminent scientists in the field of physics, Dr. William Tiller, who wrote a preface to quite a delightful book, not a new book, it's been out for several years, the work by Itzhak Bentov called Stalking the Wild Pendulum. It's a delightful book. I think sets forth very clearly many of these things with very simple little diagrams, stalking the wild pendulum. He points out that we have come to think that the renowned scientific method is to be coldly objective about an experiment, because that has been very effective for much of the past experimentation. However, the scientific method is really to provide the necessary and sufficient protocol for anyone, anywhere, to successfully duplicate the experimental result. If this requires a positive, negative, or neutral mental or emotional bias, then so be it. As we move off the purely physical path in our future experimentation, we will need to include clearly define and quantitatively measure these states of bias, because we shall find that the human mind and human intention alter the very substratum in which our physical laws operate.
I wonder how he proposes quantitatively to measure.
To measure, that's, you
now,
say.
That's the thing they'll never be able to do.
They'll never be able to do, you see.
There's no instruments that they do it.
That's right. There cannot be any.
Only another human being.
Yes. So it's, but you can see where science is coming up against this. I'm reading much of this, or sharing much of this, presenting much of this, because HPV, of course, in this, as in other parts of the Secret Doctrine, of course, but very much in connection with this stanza, is speaking about something of what science is going to have to come to, isn't she? So we need to be somewhat aware of it. Now that whole position is amplified in the course of Bentov's book. Bentov, incidentally, was unfortunately killed in an air accident in Chicago, and therefore we won't have anything further from him. He was well on the way, I might say, to accepting many of the theosophical premises. He had been attending a science symposium at our headquarters and was very favorably impressed with some of the concepts presented. But very much aware that this was an impossibility, just as you said, Jeffrey. And yet Tiller was enough impressed that he would present this preface to Bentov's book, and that this whole fascinating study on this principle of consciousness, or the manner in which we observe the whole process. And in one sense, I've often thought, could we become observers of the cosmogonic process as presented through these 7 stanzas? Can we really, are we involved in it? Not we as individuals, but in some collective sense involved in it. Has indeed the whole cosmogonic process been such for our system as indeed, and this follows the anthropic principle, to result in our presence as observers affecting what went before?
Good bunch of discussion.
Yes, it is, isn't it? I don't think we should be afraid to ask such a question. Quite obviously, I'm not afraid to.
I think we can follow the genesis processes in ourselves. For instance, the rising of consciousness in the 7th year is counterpart of the Manasaputras taking possession of an otherwise non-human body. It's more or less animalistic. What was the second part of your question? I think that was
well, you see, very frequently, I think, we look at this as though this was ages in the past,
Ah, yes.
some distant time, but still historical in the sense of historical time.
We can affect the issue, as I see it, about as much as a raindrop can when it falls into the ocean. The magnitude of our power content, so to speak, is so relatively small, yet.
Yeah, but even that raindrop can affect
It
the
does.
entire, it changes
Yes.
in some even infinitesimal manner.
It does. If you imagine the interference that could take place if what the scientists are beginning to claim by reason of this man observing the result of, affecting the result of experiments, if we really could do that in nature, how would we upset the workings of the whole cosmos? We can't do it yet because we don't have the power.
Yes.
At subatomic levels, the energies required to affect that experiment are relatively little. But in the main, we
In the
can't
main.
affect it.
If we get away from the purely materialistic thing, but in terms of consciousness, one drop of blue ink consciousness can color the whole bucket, or the whole universe, if you like to call it that.
Like Banquo's blood in the ocean, in Canada and the whole sea, but it doesn't do very much.
It may not, but you see, this is something I think we have to consider, because in stanza 5 we come to this, as I say, this dynamism, what I like to call the dynamism of the universe. And this is the whole action that is now set in motion, that really is present, therefore, throughout the entire system, leads to formation, leads to a concretization in that sense of form. Form building now becomes possible. You see, Bentoff puts it this way, that the theory of relativity emphasizes the notion that no matter what we observe, we always do so relative to a frame of reference that may differ from someone else's. This we know is true. But he begins his work with an analysis of sound, waves, and vibration, saying we are constantly surrounded by sound, and implies that, to oversimplify the case, we and all existent things, because now with this action of Fohat, thingness now becomes possible, doesn't it? Formation, the constant change of formation, you see. It's interesting that, of course, HPB herself heads at Fohat, the child of the septenary hierarchies. But what is happening is that he's leading to this movement that is possible to bring about formation. And therefore, he suggests, Bentoff as he put it, that we and all existent things are nothing but interference patterns. So that our reality, as he puts it, is a vibratory reality filled by sounds of different kinds. We respond to differences in these sounds. So that, you see, that's why I'm bringing it in here, because I think it helps us perhaps to see it in our own field. We could say then the absolute then is not so much a condition or a state without sound as a state without differences in sound or without interference patterns. The unconditioned has no interference patterns. The conditioned universe is filled with interference patterns, among which are us, or we. When there are different frequencies then, we may call these fields, which by their very nature organize all the structures within that field. Or as Bentoff puts it, we can visualize physical matter as being a beat frequency caused by the interaction of two such sounds having a slightly different frequency. Now, because sound is primary then, the whole universe is in constant and instant communication. In other words, as Bentov says, any serious event can be known across the universe instantly by consciousnesses whose interest or business it is to know these things, which includes some of the hierarchies, the higher reaches of the hierarchies. One should maybe assume that it's their business to know some of these things, perhaps the Dhyani Buddhas, the Dhyani Bodhisattvas, the Manushas, so on, the various hierarchical groups, if you like. And the implication is startling, therefore, to use Bentov's words. We can be sure that we are sharing a universe in which all the problems that may seem to be problems to us at present have been solved over and over by civilizations ahead of us in time. We may say, therefore, that all knowledge that was ever generated is potentially available to us at some point or other in our universe. So when you say, as you just did, Jeffrey, where is this knowledge that is our own? You say, we can say, the knowledge that is the wisdom of the, let us say, the Dhyani Buddhas in this series of hierarchies, you say, that too we can tune into at any moment. It's present. So I think these are interesting further as we're dealing with consciousness in all its aspects, having agreed, I'm sure, that consciousness is primary. The important thing is to realize is that the universe, through its incentive system, which we call evolution, I love Bentov's definition of evolution as the incentive system, you see, is anxious to impart as much knowledge as possible to its sentient beings in order to allow them to move as fast as possible along the evolutionary ladder and develop their consciousness to the highest possible degree. The universe wants to make itself known to those who can comprehend its language, and that language becomes more and more intelligible to us as our spiritual component unfolds. Is that a marvelous statement?
Would you repeat it, please, George?
Yes. The important thing to realize, this is Bentov, a scientist, is that the universe, through its incentive system, which we call evolution, is anxious to impart as much knowledge as possible to its sentient beings in order to allow them to move as fast as possible along the evolutionary ladder and develop their consciousness to the highest possible degree. The universe wants to make itself known to those who can comprehend its language, and that language becomes more and more intelligible to us as our spiritual component unfolds.
Bentov is
B-E-N-T-O-V.
Would you mind repeating a bit about the interference?
Well, from
If
his
it's
point
not
of
too
view,
much
you
of it.
see, and one has to go through his whole argument on waves and vibrations, but we are simply interferences, you see. We're interference patterns, you see. And then all the action of Fohat, the self-excited circuitry, and indeed it is circuitry as you go through stanza 5, because Fohat is moving in 3 and 7 strides, circumgyrating, and he's doing all sorts of things. moving in all directions at once. He always reminds me a bit of Sancho Panza in Don Quixote, you see. He got in his horse and galloped off in all directions. And that's just about what Fouhat does, doesn't he? In fact, I think Sancho Panza is a marvelous representation of Fouhat, you see. If you'd like to find it in Don Quixote. Spanish friends will enjoy that, I'm sure. But isn't that true? You see, he does. Moves in all directions. Adam?
Sure. The way you're using the word interference here, I suspect has a rather special connotation.
Yes. Yes.
It's probably, I suspect, being used in the sense in which a physicist would use it.
That's
talking
right.
about light waves producing interference patterns as they meet.
As they meet, they produce
meddling,
interference.
which would be another, not meddling.
Not meddling. No, not meddling. No, not interference in, No, not in any meddling sense, but the way in which light waves do meet and then produce these patterns, which are called interference patterns. So, well, it's not possible, of course, to get into the technical aspects. I'm not a physicist by training or anything else, but I attempt to read the books at least, except the most technical ones. But it seems to me that, you see, imagine if HPB had had some of these contemporary, the results of some of this contemporary thinking based on very much of it based, of course, not only on experimentation, some of it couldn't be subject to experimentation, but based on very competent mathematical equations which arise out of experimentation or which precede the experimentation. If she had had some of this available, you see, it might have been a little easier for her.
She does have one example that directly parallels what you're talking about, and that's the lycopodium experiment, powder experiment on a plate, and you bow the edge of the plate. And you see the patterns that
you see the
lycopodium is formed into. That is a sound phenomenon.
Oh, that's very sound, yes.
Whether or not it's an exact example of interference patterns or not, I don't know, but it's
well,
very much
good
what
friend,
is meant.
come in. Here is the one who will explain it all. Make a place for you, Adele. Come over, Adele. Come around. You may need to come around here. No. Wonderful to see you. Great to see you. How about that? Wonderful. Compatriots who understand the English language as it is correctly spoken in the United States. For those of you who may not know them, John and Adele Algio.
They know us now, Joe.
Well, you see, again, as one writer has put it, in the new physics, consciousness is found to be the only phenomenon that does indeed exist. Therefore, the new physics believes that both matter and space owe their existence to the human consciousness. Reality itself is thus viewed as a super hologram which the consciousness creates for itself. So if we could turn this around and say that this is consciousness, we can accept the proposition, perhaps, that the entire matter-space-time matrix of the physical universe owes its existence to consciousness. So it is this dynamism, however, that now becomes important to us as we turn to stanza 5. And an important point that we must therefore keep in mind, that just as the hallmark, as we've already indicated, that distinguishes the science of this century from that of the last, is really the discovery that no one can dissociate himself from what he is observing or what he is measuring. One philosopher, Cassirer, has asked, what are concepts, say formulations and creations of thought, which instead of giving us the true forms of objects, show us rather the forms of thought itself? We have to keep this in mind, I think, as we look at these matters. We're attempting to put into language, as though objective to us then, processes which are really patterns of our own being, which is why I asked that question, Jeffrey, you see. If we were to look at these stanzas as though they were present and processes within us, not, you see, it's so easy, I think, to slip into the feeling that this is something that occurred in some historical time, whether it's, 8,000 years ago, or 10,000, or a billion years, or 18 billion years, or whatever the time frame may be, and to see them, therefore, as accomplished, rather than as immediately present and therefore accessible to us.
And going on now.
And going on
Continue-
now,
continuing.
yes. Mhm. That was the basis of my question. As one writer has said, you see, consciousness is a singular of which we have no plural. Can it be plural? Therefore, if it's of this nature, we can tune in at any time. In any event, as I say, we're attempting to put into languages processes which are patterns then of our own being. And this is why it seems to me HPB resorts again and again to the language of symbol, allegory, myth, the language of poetry, which is really, of course, the language of the stanzas themselves. And consequently, I continue to point out and to emphasize that language results from our mode of thinking, our mode of knowing. Indeed, it has been suggested that our universe is word-built. Our reality is a semantic creation largely constructed by our cultural beliefs. I think it needs stressing what is our frame of reference and so on. But in this sense, we approach this also.
I think whereas metaphysically you can regard consciousness as non-fractionable or something. We have to be careful about that, because each of us in our own ordinary living feels to have a private consciousness. And whereas you might not be able to divide consciousness itself, the vehicles through which it operates are certainly separate at our level of being.
That's right.
And so we mustn't sort of hoodwink ourselves.
Oh, no. Oh, I quite agree with you.
The qualitative nature of consciousness is unitary.
You can't get away
that
from
each
that.
person's consciousness is the same. And because it derives from the same source, but we feel to be separate when we're operating at this level.
Yes. And this is, yes, we do. We very much feel ourselves to be separate. And therefore we say, and this is the paradox of it, I don't know what you're thinking, you see, or I don't know what's going on in your consciousness. I can only know what's going on in mine. And yet, can I say that there is a distinction between your consciousness and my consciousness, per se?
No, those are only the contents of consciousness.
Only the contents.
The thing that does the knowing is the same as all.
Yes. So this is the point. And what I wanted to stress, of course, by bringing this in at this particular point with stanza 5, and I do it now because with stanza 6, which we will be dealing with tomorrow, we come to a very remarkable shift, several remarkable shifts. First of all, With stanza 6, as she tells us, it's not from the same tradition. She says she translates it from the Chinese. What does this mean? If we have already established, and John, I've been referring to your article in the Australian, Theosophy Australia, which I think is certainly evidenced in the Secret Doctrine, that Censar is a language of symbol, very much. Now, why does she then shift? Well, we will have to look at that a bit tomorrow. And also, with stanza 6, we have a sharp division. She tells us some 11 stanzas are now omitted. And does she do this because those 11 stanzas would have further bewildered us? I don't think she was being that kind and generous, frankly. I think if she thought they were important, she would have included them, no matter how much they might have bewildered students. I don't think she was at all concerned over confusing people. She would have written it very differently anyway. But did she do it in order to indicate the major stages, which I've suggested as sevenfold in this sense, or the 6 plus 1, the 1 being the first, which is a completely other side of the curtain affair, completely in darkness, as it were, preceding any possibility of a dawn of light, as it seems. But in any event, these are questions. So that's how I wanted to bring it in at this point. And as I've already said, this stanza now indicates to us a stage, a third stage in the cosmic process, whereby this imaginal content of mind, the archetypes which we looked at a bit yesterday, begins to be exteriorized as a universe of form. Begins to be exteriorized. And as she states in her commentary on this, HPB says, the subject is a difficult one, in which the whole mystery of evolutionary creation is contained. The whole mystery. She again and again tells us that, you know, the mystery of this or the mystery of that is contained there. Well, a central aspect of that mystery does seem to concern man himself, or more properly, the human stage. And that seems to be central to it, because it is at this point in her own exposition that HPB introduces a concept that is still so revolutionary, I think, that it has yet to be acknowledged by contemporary thinkers, although it's implicit in the views of the universe that are emerging out of the new physics that I've already quoted. It's that, to use the phrase of Larry Dossett, to whom I've referred, the implication today is that human consciousness participates in the addition of reality that meets our eye. Or, as HPB phrased it, the doctrine teaches, this is page 106, volume 1, the doctrine teaches that in order to become a divine, fully conscious God, the spiritual, primeval intelligences must pass through the human stage. And of course, she says, when we say human, this does not apply merely to our terrestrial humanity, but to the mortals that inhabit any world, that is, to those intelligences that have reached the appropriate equilibrium between matter and spirit, as we have now. And she adds, I think, a statement that deserves a great deal of thought and consideration. Each entity must have won for itself the right of becoming divine through self-experience. Now, all that self-experience involves is this entire cosmogonic process in our own terms, as reflection. Yampi?
Yes, what I was going to say was, I think that all you have just said about man and the state and so on needs repetition. So could we have it all again?
Yes, I'd be glad to give it all again, because I think it's so interesting that she introduces it at this point, you say. This, in one sense, we can say, is before man appears on the stage, isn't it? I mean, because it's only in the middle of the sixth stanza that she says, now I'm going to get down to what goes on our planet, on the fourth globe, etc., etc., etc. But she introduces it at this point, that the doctrine teaches, and if you underline your books, for heaven's sakes, underline this. If you don't underline your books like Adam does it, why, what do? Make a margin? No, you can't make a marginal note. You put it in a notebook somewhere.
You mustn't
You put
underline
it in your head.
Wherever it is that Jeffrey buries all this information.
Oh, yes, it's wherever Jeffrey's keeping all this information, yes. That's right. Well,
It's a good place, isn't it?
It is. No pencils needed.
no pencils needed there, all right. But anyway, remember, the doctrine teaches. I have a way that every time HPB comes up with the principal tenet, the doctrine teaches, any of these statements of feeling that they should be somewhere engraved on consciousness in this storehouse that Jeffrey has already told us about. The doctrine teaches that in order to become a divine, fully conscious God,
Page reference, please.
page 106, 106 of volume 1.
167 in Agile.
167.
167 in the Adyar edition, page 106 in the oh, I'm sorry. All right, turn to stanza 5, the commentary on Shloka 1, and it is the second paragraph. Good. Everybody is found. The doctrine teaches that in order to become a divine, fully conscious God, even the highest, the spiritual, primeval intelligences must pass through the human stage. When we say human, now she's very clear on this, you see. She helps us. She doesn't always help us, but this time she does, by telling us what she means by this human stage. This does not apply merely to our terrestrial humanity. It doesn't say it doesn't apply at all, but it doesn't apply merely to it. But to the mortals that inhabit any world, that is, mortals, those subject to the transition, death, those subject to a transitory existence. Therefore, consciousness is primary because it's not the vehicle, therefore, that is important. But to the mortals that inhabit any world, that is, to those intelligences. And you remember we've already established as consciousness is primary, then all the hierarchies are intelligences. And Adam went through this yesterday afternoon, more clearly. All these hierarchies are intelligences. So we have to realize that because, again, consciousness is primary. Those intelligences that have reached the appropriate equilibrium between matter and spirit, as we have now since the middle point of the fourth root race of the fourth round was passed. So some of that, you see, you can more or less pass over.
It should be the midpoint of the third.
Yes, I would have thought them. Why does she say the middle point of the fourth root race? Because I would have thought the middle point of the third root race, the coming of the long. Could be. Well, a mistake.
Towards the end. Right.
Go ahead, Yanti, and then
Towards the end of the second volume, or number 4 of Adyar, she makes it very clear that whenever she uses the word man, she does not necessarily mean a being with 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head.
yes.
She spells it out.
Yeah.
We do not mean a being with 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head. But then in the recapitulation, That is paragraph 6 of the summary, the summing up at the end of volume 1 or volume 1 part 1. That's 275 in the original and something like 317 in Adyar, or just a bit further. It's paragraph 6 of the recapitulation. She goes over all of this and talks about each of these beings either was or prepares to become a man, if not in the present, then in the past or a coming cycle. And so on. All about hierarchies. The whole cosmos is guided, controlled, and animated by almost endless series of hierarchies and so on and so on. And then each of these beings either was or prepares to become a man. In other words, they're passed through.
They're all passed through this stage,
which is called human.
But why, you see, I don't think she's made a mistake here, Jeff.
I've just discovered.
I don't think she's made a mistake at all.
Your first year ends with your first birthday.
That's it. So it seems to me, you see, she's talking about the equilibrium since the middle point of the fourth root race of the fourth round is passed.
We passed the end of the third. We're
That's
at
right.
the fourth and halfway through.
Halfway through. That's right.
Correct.
Yes. So
Take
it's,
that.
all right. Good. No mistake. All right. And then this very, very important statement, each entity must have won for itself the right of becoming divine through self-experience. Now, you remember when we began on the 10 themes, the 10 mythologies that I suggested, or the 12, the final one was failure. Failures are indeed possible. I think somewhere in the things you've quoted, Adam, in your book, you have that statement too, don't you, from the Mahamalayan. So we haven't quite come to that in your presentations, however, but I assume we are going to talk about it. So failure is possible, even though we have come to this midpoint, or even though we have this appropriate equilibrium established. All that is meant by self-experience is an interesting subject to discuss also. Does this mean that we must pass through every experience? This, of course, led to great debate when Light on the Path was published, as some of you may remember, in successive years. Tremendous debate broke out over.
Must mean experience of self.
All right. Self-experience. What does self-experience mean? You see, Muriel suggests experience of self. What does self-experience mean?
It can't be had until we've established, what I call anyway, our reflexive consciousness, that by which we know ourselves. I don't know where that arises, but I guess it must be a function of the higher mind reflecting into the lower, whereby the contents of the lower mind can become available to it. See, we identify ourselves with what goes on in all the lower elements of our being, the personal being, but there is something that can get outside of that and to which those things can become objective. I think that's self-consciousness.
There's much to contemplate in that statement, isn't there? Now, why does she introduce it here in a discussion of what I'm calling the third stage in the cosmogonic process? Why does she introduce it here? I'm suggesting that perhaps for the same reason that contemporary physicists have had to acknowledge the centrality of subjectivity. That is, have had to acknowledge and recognize that a strictly objective view is impossible. One must recognize, for a manifested system, consciousness is required. Ultimately, that consciousness must be focused in such a manner as to become self-consciousness. And so perhaps we can only respond to the question why in much the same way as the contemporary physicist does, that is the way things are. It's the just so-ness which we have with number. The very process of exteriorization of universal mind, Mahat, divine mind, not only exhibits the content side of space, the mother or matrix, but also its illumination from within, and therefore the awakening of consciousness in accordance with its own self-nature. It's a self-excited circuit. Its own self-nature, Svabhava. This is reflected throughout the system, most particularly through the human stage. As HPB indeed says, in response to her own query as to whether occultists believe in the hierarchical ladder of entities, often called sons of light, she says there in the very first paragraph on page 106 that we must admit the existence of these entities if we would not reject the existence of spiritual humanity within physical humanity, within physical mankind. For the hosts of these sons of light and mind-born sons of the first manifested ray of the unknown all are the very root of spiritual man. Profound doctrine, but it's coming alive today. Again, to turn to Dr. Dawsey, for example, Larry Dawsey, in his work Space-Time and Medicine, he's extrapolated from just such a view as this, the suggestion that the entire human organism is alive with thought. Therefore, medical science must change its procedures markedly. The entire human organism is alive with thought, as he's put it. Every atom in the universe, says HPV, has the potentiality of self-consciousness in it. Every atom has this potentiality. But our time is going more swiftly than I had anticipated. That is usually the way that happens. So, I need to skip over a great deal. The thing that I do want to focus on is that because now we are involved very much in this dynamism, which is marvelously set forth, again a paragraph that I think needs a special consideration, is on page 110 in Volume 1. It's one that starts, Fohat is closely related to the one life. Over just a few pages, deals with the second shloka. We're now firmly into the work of Fohat, as she says, this dynamism. A word, Fohat, she tells us, comes from the Tibetan, but it is not to be found in any Tibetan dictionary. And so my friends who are students of Tibetan tell me. So what is it? Perhaps a word that she received in her occult training. It's an extremely important, as we've already said. If you find the paragraph, Fohat being one of the most, if not the most important character in esoteric cosmogony, and then the paragraph that follows that. And here we have, I think, a summary of the entire process. A marvelous summary. Fohat is closely related to the one life. Note that that's in quotes. From the unknown one, the infinite totality, the manifested one, or the period, from the unknown one, which is the infinite totality, the manifested one, or the periodical, manvantaric deity, sometimes in one place known as the second one, in a quote that Yanti gives very frequently. Did you give it yesterday? You very frequently.
Yeah, I do
give that.
indeed.
There are two ones, sometimes known as
It's the Great Escape.
Yes, it is the Great Escape, yes. No, it's the way out. So from that unknown, the manifested one emanates Now I wonder if the word emanates there is correct, or should we go back to the word that she used in the third stanza, radiates. Because you remember, she makes a clear distinction in answering questions between radiation and emanation. And this is the universal mind, which, separated from its fountain source, is the demiurgos, or the creative logos, of the Western Kabbalists and the four-faced Brahma of the Hindu religion. In its totality, viewed from the standpoint of manifested divine thought in the esoteric doctrine, it represents the hosts of the higher creative Dhyani Chohans. In one sense, this is the army of the voice about which we spoke yesterday. These are the hierarchies which Adam spoke. Simultaneously with the evolution of universal mind, the concealed wisdom of Adi Buddha, the one supreme and eternal, manifests itself as Avalokiteshvara, the manifested Ishvara. And remember, I suggested that some scholars think of this as the looked-at sound. Sound which is now, you can look at it, just as you are an interference pattern. Therefore, you can be looked at. But you are nothing but, sound. You're nothing but sound. Creating your own frequency, your own tone, etc. And you see, she gives several different variations of it. Osiris of the Egyptians, the Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrians, the heavenly man of the Hermetic philosopher, the Logos of the Platonists, so and so on. Try to pick out what is essential there. Simultaneously, with the evolution, this concealed wisdom, the one supreme, manifests itself as the manifested Ishvara, Avalokiteshvara. By the action of that, the manifested wisdom, now called Mahat, represented by these innumerable centers of spiritual energy in the cosmos, the reflection of that, which is cosmic ideation, and the intellectual force accompanying such ideation, becomes objectively the fohat of the Buddhist esoteric philosophy. Yes,
May I throw in a thought which is probably miles wrong, but it satisfies me, so it might help somebody else. On derivation of fohat.
Yes.
Where she uses, in which way we can see the way she uses fohat and mahat. Well, she also frequently uses the odd Chinese.
Yes.
And of course, Fo is Chinese for Buddha.
Yes.
So I like to
yes.
think of fohat as Buddha nature.
And it is, and you see,
which gives
she
you a
virtually
vitality to
identifies
Buddhist scriptures then.
Wonderful.
If you use fohat as Buddha nature in the Buddhist scriptures,
yes,
it gives this tremendous vitality to the phrase.
That's marvelous. Yes, thank you very much. She indicates that, in the transactions of the Blavatsky Lodge, the term fohat is defined by HPB. She says there that it is a Turanian compound, and its meanings are various. And in China, fo is the word for animal soul, but it isn't, is it?
It's used for Buddha.
It's used for Buddha.
Always. Yes.
And that, I think, makes it much more meaningful. The vital nefesh, or the breath of life.
The Buddha nature, which is within all sentient beings.
Yeah. Then she says, some say that it is derived from the Sanskrit bu, B-H-U, meaning existence, or rather the essence of existence. Now, Svayambhu means Brahma and man at the same time. So this again would point back.
Yes, and the root of Buddha in that way.
Yes, the root of Buddha in that way.
Yes, I think perhaps you ought not to have changed your note there about the animal soul. Fohat equates to the what you might call the energies, the forces, the powers, the karma, of karma, A-A-M-A,
yes.
which is the animal soul.
That's
now
right.
that derives from Jiva, which is the Buddha nature.
Yes, and one thing that I had intended, I'm not terribly good at putting this whole diagram on the board, But just before we adjourn, well, let me finish this paragraph first, and then we'll come back. But thank you so much, Nirna. No, you're right, because Fohat has all of these transformations. And as I said yesterday, HPB in the esoteric writings indicates he has 3 sons.
The derivation of Fohat is of the above crown, or is way up.
Is way up, yes, of course.
The others.
But then Fohat, running along the 7 principles of Akasha, acts upon manifested substance of the one element, and by differentiating it into various centers of energy, and again, you recall that diagram in Günther's work, you see, of this circulating, this motion, circumgyratory motion, which in itself produces the web, you see, in the matrix of mystery, those wonderful diagrams which, so far as we can, illustrate this, you see. Various centers of energy sets in motion the law of cosmic evolution, which in obedience to the ideation of the universal mind, the archetypes, brings into existence all the various states of being, that is, all the fields of existence are what we call the planes. But these fields are nothing other than the primary energy, the primordial dynamism, and result then, in another sense, in what we call the tattvas, the measures of thatness, which is tattva, that, tva, a kind of quality of it, the nessness of it. So we have then the entire system there. Now, note she says in the final paragraph there, such is the teaching of the Trans-Himalayan esotericism. So this is something. But there in that paragraph, we have these initial stages very clearly defined, it seems to me. It's a very important paragraph and deserves a great deal of thought and attention. In that regard, and I'll keep you just 2 minutes more, I would like to refer you to something that I think is not given a great deal of attention. It was something that was one of Fritz Kunz's favorite favorite notes or favorite teachings, or presentation of the teachings. I think it's one of the most abstruse documents that we have from the early days of the Society, when some of the teaching was being given directly to Mr. Sinnott by the adept teachers. And it's a document which appears only in, it was recorded by Mr. Sinnott in his manuscript book, and it appears only as Appendix 2 in the book Letters of H.P. Blavatsky to A.P. Sinnott. It is something that really should be studied in depth, and it's something I thought one of these days I'm going to be brave enough to do a whole series on, because there is so much in it, and it's called Cosmological Notes. It's Cosmological Notes from A.P. Sinnott's manuscript book, and it's a tremendous work, and that shows very clearly in this diagram cosmic ideation. There is Fohat, Akasha, and just as you said, Jeffrey, you see, there is a direct relation between Kamarupa, and indeed this explains that the statement which Adam had, and which I think you will be investigating, on what happens to the principles after death. And here it is, all in diagrammatic form. If I were very good, I would have gotten in here early and tried to put it on the board, but it's a tremendous amount to get on the board. Well, I've already...
Can you pin it there for...
Yes, I'll pin it there.
Yeah.
Yes, you can. It deserves a great deal of study. And if time permits afterwards, I'd like to look briefly at these cosmological notes. Because
where were they joined?
they're an appendix, the second appendix, in the book, Letters of H.P. Blavatsky to A.P. Sinnott.
Some of those are nearly incomprehensible as well.
They are. The cosmological notes are quite incomprehensible, you know. You see, well, it starts, what are the different kinds of knowledge? The real and the unreal. The real, which is D-G-Y-U, I don't know how to pronounce it. D-G-Y-U. You can do what you like with it. Dew. Becomes full hot when in its activity. Active agent of will, electricity, no other name. That's the master speaking. And that is very important. And this is what I've been emphasizing. I spoke of it very greatly. This is something we have to realize, and we can experience it. Jeffrey's already mentioned this, that you can recognize the existence of a strong magnetic field, for example, and we can experiment with that. So this is certainly recognizable. The cosmological notes were certainly, as they were provided us by the Mahatma Maurya, must have they take this as a fundamental given, which would certainly be indicative that the master knew as early as 1880 all that is now furnished by the calculations of the modern quantum physicist, but knew it from the metaphysical point of view. And it is quite evident, therefore, that the masters spoke from experience. I think that this is something that we have to be very clear about. Now, coming to this, and this is, you see, pertinent to stanza 5, because here in the action of Fohat, which is defined in the notes as the real, the fundamental wisdom is recognized as Fohat, as I'm so glad Muriel brought that up, as the Buddha nature. It's present in all things, and that is very, very clear in the cosmological notes. That then, therefore, this non-material reality exhibits itself in force fields in various ways. Now, this is precisely the view of the Theosophical philosophy. The so-called etheric double, when charged with a field force, akasha, is linga sharira. It's a dissolvable thing, sharira, bearing the characteristic mark, linga, of the appropriate harmonic plastic reality, akasha. And when the physical body dies, the akasha is withdrawn, we know that there is no longer a true linga sharira. But this is a force field. Again, a physical body, when just dead, is all there is, a mass, but it's lost its special field force animators. And so it's no longer a viable vehicle, we can say. Now, for such considerations, we can employ contemporary realistic scientific knowledge. If we are truly to understand the heritage that we have, we can educate ourselves in this. Now, the student, therefore, who tends to pursue this really needs to follow the cosmological notes in detail. If you have the text, for example, you begin to see that the importance of the modern force field concept and the role of pure thought as a causal reality. We've talked about that, the universal mind, the causal reality, and of the harmonic microcosm, which is harmonic in relation to the manner in which the energy is operative. Therefore, we have the passage in the Mahatma letters, which is repeated in the cosmological notes, or it's translated in a sense from the cosmological notes, that a human psychic personality is built upon a temporary arrangement of 3 stationary states plus the ground state. Now, let me define these terms. the force field, or the field, what we can also call the tattva, and in the Kashmir-Shaivite system, Dr. Taimni very much refers to these as the tattvas, but this is also a teaching very much found in the Secret Doctrine as the tattvas, particularly in the esoteric writings. One finds it's a great deal of attention. In fact, HPB makes the statement, which I don't have immediately before me, and therefore may not quote accurately. Jeffrey may be able to quote it more accurately for me. By the tattvas are the tattvas known, and the tattvas are the universe. This is, and one knows them by the tattvas. Something like that. It's a remarkable statement that appears in this.
We are really an agglomeration of them.
We are an agglomeration.
Were that not the case, we couldn't respond to them.
Yeah.
That's what it means.
So,
as I see it.
that's right. So by field is meant the non-material force structures which are revealed, the structures are revealed by the manner of the dynamism, the operation of the dynamism. And this, you see, HPB, in the stanza, we have 3 and 5 strides, for example. And we have the circumgyratory motion. You have it in the very first shloka, of course, as simply from their holy circumgyrating breast, the fiery whirlwind, you see. And then we move on through the shlokas in the motion that is indicated, and the formation of the wheels and so on. Kohot traces spiral lines. Again and again you get this ianthe spiralicity. We might not follow along. I've been inventing words all week, John. Isn't that appropriate? So there is a spiralicity involved, you see. Now, therefore, the field is the non-material force structured by, or its structure is revealed by that which is within it. Who was it? Oh, Nikki, you were telling me about this stirring process. I think that was a marvelous illustration. Tell everybody, you don't mind. I mean, I share with you not being a very good cook, too.
I was making a sauce, and I was thinking about this because I just read it, and I liquidized some vegetables, so they're all in bits. The sauce. So I poured in the corn flour and was stirring it and watched it as it kind of amalgamated the whole thing, but because somehow I can't do it properly, there were sort of lumps. And of energy sources of energy got bigger. In the one hole. And I thought, well, that's what flour is, possibly a corn flour.
It's a marvelous illustration. So anyone who's had this experience of stirring in corn flour, you say, in the sauce, and, you know, it pretty soon begins to congeal and gets stiffer and stiffer. There you are. So the field is revealed, but it's given witness to by the structure reveals itself in accordance with the force. By ground state, what we mean, what the physicist means, is the most permanent and economic of such a field. And this comes back to what I said about scientists today saying that the best laws are those which reveal simplicity and elegance. That this is the most economical condition. And by stationary state, any other characteristic durable condition of such a field. So we can use these terms if we like. Now, therefore, the cosmological notes point to the human psychic personality built upon a temporary arrangement of 3 stationary states. which are styled Linga Sharira, Kama Rupa, and Animal Soul. At the extinction of the personality, the viable forces at work in the psyche resolve into their sources. And so that's what the diagram suggests. Resolve into their sources, and you begin to see this as sort of, this is the Jivatma. And so resolve, the forces are withdrawn, and they resolve into their sources. These three the universal three, according to the cosmological notes, are all aspects of Foha, taken as a ground state, just as the psychic three are aspects or stationary states of the ground state called Jivatma. The Jivatma itself dissolves away into Foha. So we have then the worlds of effects, of course, are not localities. They're the shadow of the world of causes. And we already had this in the diagram, which Adam gave us, I think, on the very first day, wasn't it? Second day, yes. So that we have the world of causes and the world of effects, the shadow of the world of causes. Worlds having, like men, their 7 principles, which develop and grow simultaneously with the body. So the body of man is wedded to and remains forever within the body of his planet. His individual Jivatma, or life principle, animal spirits, returns after death to its source, Foha. His Linga Shariram will be drawn into Akasha. His Kama Rupa will recommingle with the universal Shakti, the will force, or universal energy. His animal soul, borrowed from the breath of universal mind, will return to the Dhyan Chohans. His 6th principle, whether drawn into or ejected from the matrix of the great passive principle, must remain in its own sphere, either as part of the crude material or as an individualized entity to be reborn in a higher world of causes. Now, the flat page of the diagram represents then the absolute. The circle is a delimited universe with 5 material elements, earth, water, air, and 2 others. And the 2 non-material elements, cosmic ideation and cosmic energy, entering from above, and therefore it's open at the top. The sector is open. That 6th or top segment is open to the space of the page to remind us that between Parabrahm and Brahm, the divine mind force, is an intermediate stage, Brahman, in which pure field forces not invested in matter are at work. Now the opposite or lower sector represents the human psyche radiated into being by the primary forces. You can imagine therefore Jivatma as the radiation of Foha through the point monad, the center, the diagram's central point, into the water element, psyche, and observe that 3 aspects of cosmic energy as Fohat display themselves now. And the central arcs show ranges of experience. The shortest indicates the oscillation. These 3. This is the shortest one, the oscillation. The further and more larger oscillation that takes place. Ranges of experience. The shortest one indicates the oscillation called human reincarnation, the result of the skandhas and all the rest. The other arcs may suggest the vast range of experience of the Chohan, of the young Chohans, and so on. You can notice that Kama Rupa is thus styled because it embodies most particularly Kama, or Eros, as the universal Shakti. It is not Kama only in the sense of a craving, restless, radiant, ovoid globe. It's very much more than that, it seems to me, and represents then the embodiment, if you like, or the display of that original force. Fritz felt that this diagram would help locate the unawakened reincarnating person in the spectrum of cosmic principles. And I think it rather does help us with that. Fohat then, from this point of view, may be said to have three aspects. It operates in and through Akasha, which Fohat lights into use. The Shakti, or universal energy, is the active aspect, and the collective intelligence, Yan Chohans, are the guiding aspect, and therefore reflect. There's very much more that could be said about these cosmological notes. Fritz used to lecture endlessly on them, and my notes are mainly from him, therefore. But I think it really begins to help us to see that something of this very important concept. I think, you see, to understand it, we should, as usual, seek first within ourselves till we find that power which brings forth, holds in being, and again withdraws the multiform contents of our psyches. And I think if we do look within ourselves, we begin to have an appreciation for something. We're not speaking then essentially of some energy or force outside ourselves. It's the dynamism of the universal process and the dynamism of our being, even of our personal being. Not to be thought of course, in terms of a mechanical force, nor to be given a deific personality. It's not a personal being, but a power. Not a mechanical power, but a living one, as indeed are all the powers in the cosmos. One could say that, as indeed H.P.B. says at the very outset in the proem, that it springs from the tension relating the first unmanifest father-mother duality, which is the origin of all power. And so very early in the proem, you remember, she introduces us to this as the third resultant, if you like, or it's a manifest from the tension. But we can see it, therefore, as also the tension between what we could call the brother-sister duality within the universal mind. And so it is present all the way down. And I think there's quite an overview of it in Barborca's work, The Divine Plan. Again, we don't need to go into it. He writes very simply that Fohat may be regarded as a bridge between the unmanifested and the manifested. For once that Fohat enters into activity upon the stage, things begin to happen. Well, things come. Happenings become things. I think we can even turn it around. Happenings now become things. But we remember that it's on the stage even during pralaya, since everything that will be present in a manifested universe must, according to this doctrine, be present in potentia during the unmanifest period. But we also have to keep in mind what H.P.B. said very clearly. Fohat is one thing in the yet unmanifested universe and another in the phenomenal and cosmic world. Now, I cannot believe that she meant that it is completely other, but rather that other characteristics of a primordial motion or energy display themselves.
I can only think she means that it's inoperative. It's in a sleeping state like the rest
Yes,
of the things.
that's right. And so now it becomes fully operative as a dynamic power. That is the way I read it. Well, I've wandered into very deep waters, not at all easy. The point is, of course, that the mode of motion is always circular, and that I think is an important point in this. Perhaps this is reflected in the concept of the curvature of space. Therefore, space is indeed, by the very operation of this dynamism, it becomes curved. It draws in upon itself. Circular errands that Fohat is performing result in the organization then of vortical systems around each point-like center in the universal mind, converting, as he was converting the liquid into lumpy bits, converting the homogeneous unity into a number of separate entities linked with each other as parts of the manifold. So the conversion of the pervading unity into a number of separate points into separate points, really points of view. From another aspect, we can say that each of us is simply a point of view. You see? Because what you see cannot be the same thing that I see, so we are points of view. And the conversion of that pervading unity into a number of points of view is the effect of the circular action of Fohat, which cuts off or veils the inner unity and replaces it by an outer connectedness. Well, as I say, there's very, very much more. There is, of course, HPB says he is metaphysically the objectivized thought of the gods, the word made flesh, the messenger of cosmic and human ideations. And she makes a very interesting statement in paper 3 of the esoteric teachings. Let me just quote this, since in paper 3 it's in the esoteric teachings, either the volume of the esoteric writings or in volume 12, the collected writings. She says in these volumes it is almost revealed that the sons of Fohat are the personified forces known in a general way as motion, sound, heat, light, cohesion, electricity or electric fluid, and nerve force or magnetism. This truth, however, cannot teach the student to attune and moderate the kundalini of the cosmic plane with the vital kundalini, the electric fluid with the nerve force. The 7 Shaktis, respectively called Parashakti, Jnana Shakti, etc., are synonymous with the sons of Fohat, for they are their female aspects. Now, these Shaktis, in their section summing up to which, that area to which Dianthe's already referred, HPB quotes Theosophical again concerning the forces, these 6 forces which are summed up or represented in their unity by the 7th, Daivi Prakriti, the light of the Logos, the illumined causative stuff, if you like. What else can I quote? The Daivi, which is the same word we have in Deva and so on, which is self-lit, and Prakriti, the causative stuff, which now is prepared for emanation. And Sivaro indicates there are 6 primary forces, Shaktis, and he enumerates them there. We won't go into that, but HPB at the end of it says, it is all esoteric, though not covering the 10th part of what might be said. For one, the 6 names of the 6 forces mentioned are those of the 6 hierarchies of Dhyani Chohans, synthesized by their primary, the 7th, who personify the 5th principle of cosmic nature, or of the mother in its mystical sense. And then she adds, whether by exaggeration or by intent, the enumeration alone of the yoga powers would require 10 volumes. Each of these forces has a living, conscious entity at its head, of which entity it is an emanation. So we're right back to the point that Adam made yesterday, that these hierarchies emanate from and within each other, but they are also personifications of these primary forces. All, of course, are representations of permutations of the changing conditions of the one primary force, which is now operative as in stanza 5 of Kohut. Now, as I say, I have wandered off into very deep waters. I think it's time I came up to the surface for some breath, because it's not an easy subject, and you can see therefore why HPB says at the very outset of this stanza that this is perhaps the most difficult of all the stanzas to explain. Its language is comprehensible only to him who is thoroughly versed in Eastern allegory and its purposely obscure phraseology. On the other hand, I think that contemporary physics is helping us, and if our whole thinking can be changed from thingness to process, which is a difficult shift, but if our thinking begins to be changed, and our language, therefore, you see, which I've been doing purposely for you, I've been shifting our language for you, I think we begin to get some faint realization of it. Comments or questions?
For me, about today physics, I don't understand anything.
Yeah.
I have to go into the history.
It's quite amazing, and I wonder how people of her time, without what we know today in terms of force fields and so on, how they did study it. As I said the other night, of course, what were the students in when the American section was chartered in 1886, or the English section? What was your charter date, 1888?
The heart of the masters.
A couple of years later, wasn't it?
1888.
1888.
British section.
Yeah, that's what I thought, the British section. Ah, you see, I got it right. You see, but that, actually the charter date was just before the Secret Doctrine, I think, was issued. But imagine dealing with this, you see. I mean, it's a wonder the British section didn't collapse immediately on the publication of the Secret Doctrine. In one sense, I mean, the members must have felt, my Lord, is this what we've gotten into? When suddenly the Secret Doctrine was in their hands. And there was so little that could be brought in, other than the allegories and myths to which she refers, which, of course, at that time were very much ridiculed. Who was going to study mythology with any, seriousness?
Yes, you asked how people knew about it before this book was published. Well, what about the German shoemaker man? What was his name? Werner?
Oh, Weber, yes,
You see,
yes, Weber,
they had the vision direct.
Oh, yes.
They couldn't very well express it, but their teachings weren't heeded.
Oh, yes, that's right.
But what they told us was, in fact, what is unfolded in these books.
Oh, yes. Well, there were many other things, it's very true, but very difficult.
Swedenborg was another, and he got it a bit mixed up.
But he got it a bit mixed up.
According to HPB.
Yeah. But, this was not easy. And I think it's not easy yet, by any means, but certainly easier. Hmm?
It's not easier.
It's not easier.
No.
All right, the other says it is not easier.
Well, we're making mental concepts of it, but they were using a direct vision.
Yes.
And the masters doing the same thing, you see, they know what they're talking about.
That's right.
One of the things that makes it confusing, I think, for me anyway, is the multiplicity of classifications of nomenclature. We switch from Buddhist to Sanskrit, from Sanskrit to Kabbalistic, and how do we know the direct equivalence through all these?
Of course, I wonder if a great deal of this and HPB's own use of different nomenclature isn't to prod us into trying to understand or to come to the direct experience. So that we really do not get stuck in naming something. Remember, the map is not the territory. And often if you get a map, you think you've been there, sort of thing. You see, it's something that one can't define. And this is so true in so many things, isn't it? Until you hug the tree. You see, you have now that Ingrid has the direct experience, you hug the tree. And it's different than describing it. Jeffrey's description yesterday may not be what you felt today when you hugged the tree. So this is true, and I think much of the confusion of nomenclature, I'm not talking about the confusion that resulted from later attempts to redefine or simplify or whatever, but even HPB's shifting from a variety of systems was to prod us to this very point of experience. And so we come back to that statement which I read out earlier, and which I tell you I think is extremely important. Each entity must have won for itself the right of becoming divine through self-experience. So it's not enough to say Buddhi is there, as though it were somewhere, spatially, just above the treetop or somewhere, spatially located, but rather that it is directly accessible to us.
But still that phrase is like a division of the just one. It's your self-experience. Experience somebody else.
That's right. So it's not only experience of the self, you see, but also experience by the self of the self, which is the totality. Perhaps this is the royal secret. What is that knowing which? All else is known. It is in that. Well, in the time then, unless there are further comments or questions.